Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is, why did medieval people sleep underground? The brutal truth. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Why did medieval people sleep underground? The brutal truth. Imagine a world where night comes early, where the walls of a home are thick with earth, and where the quietest place to sleep is not above the ground, but beneath it. There is no electric light waiting beside the bed. There is no glass window sealed against the winter wind. There is no central heating, no soft mattress produced in a factory, and no carefully insulated bedroom designed for comfort. Instead, there is soil, stone, timber, straw, and sometimes a small space dug partly into the ground. For many people living in medieval Europe, the night could be colder than the day, and a house had to do more than provide a place to live. It had to hold warmth, it had to shelter food, it had to protect people and animals from weather, it had to make limited fuel last as long as possible. And this is where the story of sleeping underground begins. But the truth is more complicated than the simple idea that medieval people routinely lived in deep underground bedrooms. Most did not. Across medieval Europe, people lived in many different kinds of homes. Some lived in timber houses. Some lived in stone buildings. Some lived in houses partly dug into the earth. Some used cellars or sunken floors. Some built structures directly against slopes, taking advantage of the ground itself as insulation. The exact form depended on geography, climate, wealth, local building traditions, and the period of the Middle Ages. So when we imagine medieval people sleeping underground, we should not picture an enormous underground city filled with bedrooms. Instead, picture something quieter. A small dwelling, perhaps a shallow hollow cut into the earth, perhaps a sunken floor, perhaps a cellar beneath a larger house, perhaps a shelter built into a hillside. The earth around it is cold and dark, but inside, the temperature changes more slowly, and that simple physical fact could make a remarkable difference. The ground does not warm and cool as quickly as the air. A cold winter wind can pass over the surface of a field, but several feet below the surface, temperature changes are much more gradual. For someone living without modern insulation, that mattered very much. Picture yourself approaching such a dwelling near the end of an autumn day. The fields have become quiet. The last light is fading behind the trees. There may be smoke rising gently from a chimney or opening. The smell of burning wood hangs in the cold air. Your shoes are damp from the path. The earth is soft beneath your feet. Inside, the room is not luxurious. There may be a hard floor covered with straw, rushes, boards, or other locally available materials. There may be a hearth. There may be simple furniture. There may be sacks, baskets, tools, clothing, and food stored nearby. And perhaps the sleeping space is close to the warmest part of the dwelling. This was not underground living, because medieval people had discovered some mysterious secret of comfort. It was often simply practical. The earth was available. It did not need to be manufactured. It did not need to be transported from a distant town, and it could help shield a household from the worst effects of wind and changing temperatures. This is one of the quiet lessons of medieval architecture. People built with what surrounded them. Where timber was plentiful, wood became walls and roofs. Where stone was abundant, stone became a building material. Where clay was easy to obtain, earth could become part of walls and floors, and where the ground itself offered protection, builders could use the ground as part of the structure. The medieval world was full of such adaptations. A person living in a cold northern village did not have access to the same materials as someone living near a Mediterranean town. A wealthy landowner could build differently from a tenant farmer. A monastery could provide spaces that a poor rural family could never afford. And a person living in a city had different possibilities again. So the underground sleeping question is really a story about adaptation. It is a story about how ordinary people tried to make difficult environments slightly easier to endure. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the medieval home was not designed around the modern idea of a private bedroom. The modern bedroom is so familiar that it can be difficult to imagine anything else. We enter a house. We walk into a room. We close a door. We sleep. But in many medieval households, sleeping arrangements could be much more communal. Several members of a family might sleep in the same general space. Beds could be shared. Children might sleep near adults. Servants might sleep within the same building. And in poorer households, there might simply not be enough separate rooms to give everyone a private place. Privacy was often a luxury. Warmth was a necessity. That difference changes how we should imagine the medieval night. When darkness arrived, the household did not necessarily disappear into individual bedrooms. Instead, people remained together. The fire might be dying slowly. A few embers could glow beneath the ash. The roof creaked softly as the temperature fell. Someone might cough. Someone might turn over on a straw-filled mattress. A dog could shift near the warmth. Outside, the wind might move through the trees. And beneath the surface of the ground, the household would be sheltered from much of that wind. The silence underground could feel different too. Earth absorbs sound. Thick walls reduce the noise of the outside world. A shallow, earth-sheltered room could therefore feel remarkably enclosed. Yet it was not necessarily comfortable. This is where the brutal truth begins. Using the ground for shelter solved some problems while creating others. Dampness was one of the greatest. Earth contains moisture. Rainwater can move through soil. Groundwater can rise. Poor drainage can turn a floor into a cold, wet surface. And medieval builders did not possess the modern waterproof membranes, concrete foundations, drainage systems, and mechanical ventilation that we take for granted. So a dwelling partly below ground could become unpleasantly damp. The smell of wet earth could linger. Straw could become moist. Clothing could take longer to dry. Wood could decay. And in a poorly designed structure, water could become a serious threat. This is why underground living cannot be understood simply as an ancient version of a cozy basement. A modern basement is usually engineered against water. A medieval sunken dwelling often depended on local knowledge, slope, soil, drainage, roofing, and construction skill. If those things worked well, the earth could be an excellent ally. If they did not, it could become an enemy. And there was another problem: air. A human being produces moisture simply by breathing. Cooking produces steam. Wet clothing releases moisture. Animals produce moisture. A fire produces smoke. In a small enclosed space, all of these things accumulate. Ventilation therefore mattered enormously. Some structures had openings that allowed smoke and air to escape. Others had doors or roof openings. Some had hearths arranged in ways that helped manage smoke. But medieval homes could still be smoky. For people who lived with this every day, the smell of smoke was not unusual. It was part of life. Imagine waking before sunrise. The room is almost completely dark. The fire has reduced to a dull glow. The air carries the scent of ash. Your blanket feels cool. The straw beneath you is firm and uneven. For a moment, you simply listen. There is no traffic outside, no distant engine, no refrigerator humming in another room. Perhaps there is only the faint movement of someone else waking. Then comes the sound of a latch. A door opens. Cold morning air enters. And suddenly, the darkness feels less complete. This simple transition from night to morning happened thousands of times across medieval Europe. For people who lived close to the earth, daily life followed natural rhythms much more closely than ours often does. The sunrise mattered. The weather mattered. The season mattered. The amount of available firewood mattered. And daylight was valuable. A household could not simply switch on a lamp whenever it wished. Candles existed, but good candles could be expensive. Oil lamps existed in some regions. Rushlights and other simple forms of lighting were also used. But artificial light was limited compared with modern life. Night, therefore, had a physical presence. It was not merely darkness outside a brightly lit home. Darkness entered the home, and underground spaces could make that darkness even more noticeable. A person descending into a cellar or sunken room after sunset would move from the fading outdoor light into near blackness. The eyes would slowly adjust. The familiar objects of the household would disappear into shadow. The fire became the center of the room. Its light touched faces, hands, wooden beams, baskets, and walls. Everything beyond that small circle of light remained indistinct. This was the medieval night, not frightening in every moment, not dramatic, often simply quiet. And for many people, sleep came in that quiet. But why would anyone choose to build a home partly below ground in the first place? The answer begins with climate. Before modern heating and insulation, the difference between a survivable winter and a dangerous winter could sometimes depend on very ordinary decisions. How much wood did you have? How thick were your walls? How well did your roof shed rain? Could you keep the wind from entering? Could you keep your animals dry? Could you store enough food? Could you keep your children warm? These were not abstract questions. They were daily concerns. Firewood was particularly important. A modern person can turn a thermostat upward without thinking about where the energy comes from. A medieval household could not. Fuel had to be gathered, purchased, transported, or otherwise obtained. Wood had to be cut. Peat was used in some regions. Other fuels were used according to local conditions. The amount available could vary, and every extra hour spent keeping a fire burning consumed fuel. A well-designed earth-sheltered dwelling could reduce the amount of heat lost through walls. That did not make it warm by modern standards. It simply meant that the household had a little less heat to replace. That distinction is important. Medieval people were not necessarily living in warm, underground rooms. They were often trying to prevent their homes from becoming unbearably cold. The goal was not luxury, it was endurance. This difference can be seen in the construction of many traditional buildings. Thickness was valuable. Small openings were useful in cold climates. Roofs were designed according to local weather. Walls could be massive. Floors could be earthen. Sleeping areas could be placed near warmth. And the ground itself could become another layer between people and the outside air. The idea was simple. If the outside world is cold, create barriers. If the wind is strong, block it. If heat escapes quickly, slow it down. If fuel is limited, waste as little warmth as possible. Medieval builders did not describe this using modern terms like thermal mass or passive insulation. They did not need to. They learned through experience. A family that noticed a sheltered house stayed warmer would remember it. A builder who understood how water moved down a slope would use that knowledge. A village would develop its own traditions. And over generations, practical knowledge became part of local building culture. This is why the medieval landscape was not filled with identical houses. Every region had its own solutions. In some places, houses were built with substantial stone walls. In others, timber framing dominated. Elsewhere, earth and clay played major roles. In northern regions, sunken or semi-sunken structures could be useful. In areas where hillsides provided natural shelter, people could build into slopes. In warmer regions, underground spaces could have another advantage. They could remain comparatively cool during hot weather. The same principle that protects against winter cold can also moderate summer heat. The earth changes temperature slowly. A cellar can therefore remain cooler than the surface during a hot afternoon. This made underground spaces useful for storage. Food could be kept away from direct sunlight. Wine, beer, vegetables, grain, and other goods could be stored under suitable conditions. But storage and sleeping were not always separate worlds. The medieval home was multifunctional. A single building could contain living space, working space, storage space, and sleeping space. The distinction between kitchen, dining room, bedroom, and pantry that feels so obvious today was often much less rigid. A household had to use every part of its available space. And that brings us closer to the real reason some people slept close to the ground. Space was expensive, materials were valuable, labor was valuable. Land itself could be limited. If a family could use a sheltered lower level for storage and sleeping, that space served more than one purpose. There was no need to construct an elaborate separate bedroom. The household simply adapted. This was particularly important for poorer people. Medieval society contained enormous differences in wealth. A noble household might have multiple rooms, fireplaces, servants, storage areas, and substantial buildings. A peasant household could have a much smaller structure. The phrase medieval people therefore hides a great deal. There was no single medieval lifestyle. A king did not sleep like a field laborer. A wealthy merchant did not live like a poor tenant. A monk did not follow exactly the same routine as a shepherd. And a family living in England could have a very different home from one living in the Balkans, Scandinavia, Iberia, or Central Europe. Even within one village, houses could differ. Some families had better materials. Some had larger plots. Some had more animals. Some had access to woodland. Some had skilled relatives who could build. Others had almost nothing beyond their labor. So when we imagine an underground medieval dwelling, we should imagine a specific household rather than an entire civilization. Perhaps it is a small family living on the edge of a settlement. Perhaps the house has a sunken floor. The walls rise only partly above ground. The roof is supported by timber. The entrance is narrow. Rain falls outside. Inside, the temperature remains steadier. The family has arranged their possessions carefully because there is little space. A wooden bowl, a cooking pot, a few tools, a chest, bundles of clothing, food stored against the coming winter, and somewhere in the room, a place to sleep. There may be no softness beyond straw, wool, fur, or cloth. The mattress itself might be a simple bag, filled with straw or similar material. The filling could flatten over time. It could become damp. It could need replacing. Bed linen was not necessarily abundant. For poorer households, sleeping arrangements could be very simple indeed. And yet, when night finally arrives, the human body still seeks rest. After a day of walking, farming, carrying, grinding, spinning, cooking, tending animals, repairing tools, or performing countless other tasks, sleep becomes less concerned with comfort than with necessity. The body becomes heavy, the room becomes quiet, the fire grows dim, and eventually, even a hard sleeping place can feel familiar. This is something easy to forget when looking backward through history. People did not spend every night thinking about how uncomfortable their homes were. A person becomes accustomed to the world they inhabit. The smell of smoke becomes normal. The sound of livestock becomes normal. The hard floor becomes normal. The darkness becomes normal. The cold becomes normal. Not pleasant. Not necessarily desirable. Simply familiar. And perhaps this is one of the most important things to remember when imagining medieval life. We should not turn hardship into romance. But we should also not imagine that every person living centuries ago was constantly miserable. Human beings adapt. They find routines. They create habits. They share warmth. They tell stories. They eat together. They care for children. They laugh. They complain about the weather. They become attached to familiar places. Even a humble earth-sheltered home could become a place of belonging. The ground around the house might be muddy. The roof might leak occasionally. The room might smell of smoke. But it was still home. And at night, home meant safety from the outside world. Outside there could be wind, rain, snow, animals, strangers, darkness and uncertainty. Inside there were familiar voices, a familiar fire, familiar objects, familiar breathing. The earth itself formed another layer of protection. And slowly, the household settled into sleep. But not everyone slept in the same way. Medieval sleeping patterns were influenced by work, season, household routines, and cultural practices. The modern idea of one uninterrupted 8-hour sleep should not be automatically projected backward. Historical evidence suggests that sleeping practices varied considerably, and people could wake during the night. A person might rise to tend a fire. They might check an animal. They might use the necessary chamber. They might pray. They might simply wake naturally. In a dark world, nighttime was not divided into hours visible on a glowing clock. People experienced it through changes in light, bodily rhythms, sounds, and routine. And underground, these natural rhythms could feel even more pronounced. There was no window showing the moon, no street light, no bright glow from a neighboring building. The room could remain almost completely dark until someone opened the entrance or brought in a flame. Imagine waking sometime in the middle of the night. For a moment, you do not know whether an hour has passed or several. The room is silent. You can hear someone breathing nearby. The fire has almost disappeared. The air is cool. You pull the blanket closer. Above you, the roof holds back the night. Around you, the earth holds back the wind. And beneath your body, the ground remains steady and unmoving. You close your eyes again. There is nowhere else to go. The morning will arrive when it arrives. And eventually, it does. As the morning slowly arrives, a thin gray light appears around the entrance. Someone stirs. A hand reaches toward the embers. A piece of dry wood is placed carefully onto the remaining heat. The fire catches slowly. A small orange glow returns. The room changes. The darkness begins to retreat. Outside, the village wakes. A door opens somewhere nearby. Footsteps cross the earth. An animal calls. A wooden tool is moved. The day begins again. For the people living there, the underground room was not a historical curiosity. It was simply part of life. And that is perhaps why the idea feels so strange to us. We imagine underground spaces as unusual. They feel hidden, secret, almost unnatural. But to many traditional societies, living partly within the earth was simply another way of building. The ground was not only something beneath a house, it was part of the house. And once we understand that, the medieval world becomes a little easier to picture, not as a place of constant darkness and suffering, not as a fantasy landscape, but as a world where every material had a purpose, where walls had to earn their space, where firewood had to be counted, where warmth had to be protected, where sleep happened, wherever a household could create a reasonably safe and sheltered place. The underground room was therefore not necessarily a symbol of desperation. Sometimes it was. Sometimes poor construction, poverty, and harsh conditions left people with very few choices. But in other cases, earth shelter was an intelligent response to climate and materials. The same solution could arise from necessity and practical knowledge at the same time. A family could be poor and still understand how to build wisely. A shelter could be humble and still be carefully designed. A room could be uncomfortable and still be warmer than the open air. History rarely gives us simple answers. And as we move deeper into the medieval landscape, that complexity becomes clearer. Because beneath the image of castles, knights, churches, and kings was another world. A quieter world. The world of ordinary houses. The world of farmers returning from fields. The world of families gathering around small fires. The world of children falling asleep beside their parents. The world of people who knew the smell of wet soil better than the smell of polished stone. And sometimes, the world beneath the surface. There the night could become almost completely still. The wind passed overhead. Rain touched the roof. The earth remained cool and heavy around the walls. Inside, a few people slept. Their breathing was slow. The fire faded. And for a few hours, the household rested inside a shelter shaped partly by human hands and partly by the earth itself. The morning would come, the work would begin, and the same simple struggle would continue. To keep warm, to stay dry, to protect food, to preserve fuel, to make a home from whatever the surrounding landscape could provide. That was the real story behind medieval underground sleeping. Not a strange custom practiced by everyone, not a secret world hidden beneath every medieval village, but a practical response to the limitations of a pre-modern world. A world where the earth could be both floor and wall. Where darkness was part of the day, where warmth was precious, and where a few feet of soil could sometimes make the difference between an exposed shelter and a protected home. As night returns once more, imagine that little dwelling resting quietly beneath the stars. The village has become still. The fields are dark. The trees move gently in the wind. Below the surface, the household sleeps. There is no glowing screen, no mechanical hum, no artificial warmth spreading evenly through the room. Only the fading heat of a fire, the familiar presence of other sleeping bodies, and the steady protection of the earth. And slowly, very slowly, the medieval night passes. Night has passed quietly beneath the earth, but the story of these homes is only beginning to open. When we look at a partly sunken medieval dwelling, it is tempting to imagine that the builders simply dug a hole and placed a roof over it. In reality, construction required knowledge. Even a modest shelter had to deal with water, weight, weather, fire, and the movement of people inside it. The earth could protect a household, but only if the structure was arranged carefully. Imagine standing beside such a dwelling in the early morning. The grass is wet. The air is cool. Your breath is faintly visible. From the outside, the building might appear smaller than expected. Part of its structure is hidden below the surrounding ground. A roof rises above it, perhaps covered with thatch or another locally available material. The entrance may be reached directly from the surface, while the floor inside sits lower than the surrounding land. This lowered floor creates a curious effect. From outside, the dwelling seems modest. Inside, however, the walls can feel surprisingly substantial. The earth around the lower portion provides a barrier against wind. It also helps stabilize temperature. But the moment rain begins, another reality appears. Water always seeks the easiest path. A heavy storm can turn a small depression into a collection point for runoff. If the dwelling sits in the wrong place, water can enter through the entrance or seep through the walls. This is why location mattered. A slope could be helpful if used correctly. A poorly drained hollow could be disastrous. People who built these structures needed to understand their landscape. They learned where rainwater traveled. They noticed which soils stayed wet. They knew which places flooded after storms. They knew where frost settled. They knew which slopes remained dry. This knowledge rarely appears in grand historical records. A medieval chronicler might carefully describe a king, a battle, a bishop, or a political dispute. The same chronicler might never mention the ordinary family that knew exactly where to place its house so that winter rain would flow away from the entrance. Yet such knowledge was essential. History is often preserved through monuments. Daily life was preserved through habits, and the earth itself carries some evidence of those habits. Archaeologists have discovered traces of sunken buildings in many parts of medieval Europe. Sometimes only the lower portions remain. The wooden walls are gone. The roof has disappeared. The people who lived there have been forgotten. But the soil remembers. Darkened patches can mark former floors. Post holes can reveal where wooden supports once stood. Pits can show where storage spaces were dug. Burned material can indicate hearths. Different layers of earth can reveal how a structure changed over time. A house that once held the sounds of a family can eventually become nothing more than a shape beneath a field. Grass grows over it. Roots move through the soil. Rain falls. Seasons pass. And centuries later, someone carefully removes the earth and discovers the outline of a forgotten home. There is something peaceful about this. The people who lived there probably never imagined that strangers centuries later would stand above their sleeping place. They were not building for archaeologists. They were building for tomorrow. They needed a roof before the next storm. They needed warmth before winter. They needed somewhere to store their possessions. They needed somewhere to sleep. That was enough. And this brings us to one of the most important reasons underground and semi-underground spaces appeared in medieval settlements. Efficiency. A house did not have to be large to be useful. If part of the earth could become a wall, the builder saved materials. If the surrounding ground reduced exposure to wind, the building could be more sheltered. If the lower level could be used for storage, the household gained additional space without constructing another building. In a world where labor was difficult and materials were limited, efficiency mattered. A person did not need to understand modern architecture to appreciate this. You only had to live through winter. Imagine carrying firewood home on a cold afternoon. The wood is heavy. Your hands are rough. The path is muddy. You have already spent hours working. Every piece of fuel has required effort. Now imagine that the walls of your home lose heat quickly. You would need even more fuel. But if the walls are thick or partly surrounded by earth, the fire can work more effectively. The warmth remains longer. The household still feels cold, but perhaps the cold becomes manageable. That small improvement can matter enormously over an entire winter. This is one reason we should be careful when comparing medieval houses with modern homes. Modern homes are built around abundant energy. Medieval homes were built around limited energy. Today, we often make the building adapt to our preferred temperature. In the medieval world, people often adapted themselves to the building. They wore layers. They slept close together. They used blankets and other insulating materials. They positioned themselves near warmth. They reduced unnecessary openings. They planned daily work around weather and daylight. The building and the human body worked together. The earth was simply another part of that system. And sometimes, animals were part of it too. This may sound strange from a modern perspective, but in many traditional farming households, livestock lived very close to people. Some animals were kept in separate structures. Others might share parts of a larger building. The exact arrangement varied greatly by region and period, but keeping animals nearby had practical advantages. They needed protection from weather. They needed monitoring, and their bodies produced heat. In some houses, especially in northern climates, the arrangement of people and animals could affect the warmth of the interior. The smell, however, would have been unmistakable. Imagine entering a medieval rural dwelling after walking through a winter village. Your eyes adjust to the darkness. The air is warmer than outside. Then the smells reach you. Smoke, wood, damp wool, food, straw, human bodies, and perhaps the unmistakable smell of animals. To modern senses, it might seem overwhelming. To the people who lived there, it was ordinary. The medieval home was not a sealed, purified environment. It was alive with smells. Nothing was completely separated. Cooking, sleeping, working, storing, and caring for animals could all happen within a relatively small area. This lack of separation also explains why sleeping spaces were often shared. The household needed to use its limited room efficiently. A bed was not necessarily a private object belonging to one person. Several people could share sleeping arrangements. Children could sleep near adults. Servants could sleep within the same household complex. Visitors might be accommodated according to available space. The wealthy could enjoy more privacy, but privacy was not the default experience for everyone. This matters because the underground room was rarely just a bedroom. It could be a living space, a working space, a storage space, a cooking space, and a sleeping space. The modern distinction between rooms was much less universal. Imagine the sun setting over a medieval settlement. During daylight, the same room might have been full of movement. Someone repaired clothing, someone prepared food, someone cleaned tools, someone sorted grain. A child played near the wall. A dog rested beside the hearth. As evening came, objects were moved aside. The floor was cleared. The fire was adjusted. Bedding was prepared. The same room gradually changed its purpose. It became quieter. People settled down. The household entered the night. There was no need for a separate bedroom because the room itself transformed. This flexibility was especially useful in smaller homes, and it also tells us something about medieval ideas of space. A room did not necessarily have one permanent identity. It was defined by what people were doing there. Morning could make it a workplace. Evening could make it a dining area. Night could make it a sleeping place. The earth beneath the room remained constant through all of these changes. there is another reason underground spaces could be valuable. Security. A partly sunken structure could be less exposed to wind and weather. In some circumstances, it could also be less visible than a tall building. But we should not exaggerate this. These were not medieval bunkers. They were not designed primarily to protect families from armies. Most were simply homes, workshops, or storage structures adapted to local conditions. The medieval landscape contained genuine defensive structures, of course. Castles had walls. Towers had strong foundations. Some settlements had defensive barriers. But the ordinary sunken dwelling belonged to a very different world. Its greatest enemy was usually not a knight with a sword. It was cold, rain, dampness, fire, hunger, and the endless work of maintaining a household. Fire itself could be both friend and danger. A hearth was essential for warmth and cooking, but a fire inside a building made largely from timber, thatch, straw, and other combustible materials carried obvious risks. A small spark could become a serious fire. Smoke had to escape. Flames had to be controlled. Cooking required attention. The same fire that kept a family alive could threaten the entire home. This made the hearth one of the most important places in the medieval household. Imagine the room after sunset. The fire is burning steadily. A pot hangs above it. The flames move gently against the dark. Someone stirs the food. The walls glow faintly. The smoke rises toward an opening. Every movement around the hearth is familiar. The fire is not decoration. It is the center of daily life. Without it, the room becomes colder. Food cannot be cooked. Water cannot be heated easily. Light becomes scarce, and winter becomes much more difficult. So the household learns to live with fire. They learn how much fuel it needs. They learn which wood burns well. They learn how to preserve embers. They learn how to restart a dying flame. These skills are easy to overlook today because fire is largely hidden from our daily lives. A medieval household could not hide it. The fire was visible. Its warmth was felt. Its smoke was smelled. Its fuel had to be gathered. Its ashes had to be removed. And its behavior had to be watched. Even sleeping near it required awareness. The hearth might be allowed to burn low rather than brightly through the night. The remaining embers could provide some warmth until morning. Then someone would carefully revive them. A small movement of air, a piece of dry fuel, a little patience, and the fire would return. The same patience applied to many parts of medieval life. Clothing was repaired rather than discarded. Tools were maintained. Buildings were patched. Roofs were repaired. Walls were reinforced. Household goods were used repeatedly. Nothing was easily replaced. This makes the underground dwelling even more understandable. If the earth could help extend the usefulness of a simple building, people had a reason to use it. There was no expectation that a home should remain fashionable. It only needed to work, and working meant surviving the seasons. Winter was especially important. The cold did not arrive as a single event. It gradually changed the landscape. Leaves disappeared. Days became shorter. Fields became quiet. Roads turned muddy. Then frost arrived. Then snow in colder regions. Food stores became increasingly important. Fuel became increasingly valuable. The household could no longer depend on fresh food from the fields. Everything had to be preserved. The house therefore became part of a larger survival system. The walls protected people. The roof protected supplies. The lower spaces could protect stored food. The hearth provided heat. The earth moderated temperatures. The household moved around all of these elements. Imagine a winter evening. Outside, snow covers the ground. The wind moves across the fields. Inside, there is a small amount of warmth. A pot is simmering. Clothing hangs near the heat. The smell of cooked grain fills the room. Someone is repairing a piece of clothing. Someone else is preparing bedding. The day has ended. The family has little to do except talk quietly, work with their hands, or sleep. There is no bright entertainment waiting to occupy the evening. Darkness itself encourages rest. And slowly, the household becomes still. This does not mean medieval people were asleep from sunset to sunrise. People woke, they worked, they talked, they tended fires, they responded to needs. But the night was fundamentally different from ours. It was darker, it was quieter, and for many households, it was physically connected to the changing temperature of the environment. A person could feel winter. Not just through a weather forecast, through the walls, through the floor, through the air entering beneath the door, through the amount of wood left beside the hearth. This made shelter a daily calculation. And the ground could help. There is a simple physical reason. The deeper you go into the earth, the less directly you experience rapid changes in surface temperature. The ground stores heat and releases it, slowly. This principle is used in various forms of traditional architecture around the world. Medieval builders did not need mathematical models to discover it. They could simply notice that a cellar remained cool in summer and comparatively stable in winter. A person could walk into an underground storage space during a hot afternoon and immediately feel the difference. The air below was often still. The walls were cool. The sunlight could not reach the interior directly. This was useful for food. It was also useful for wine, beer, and other stored goods. In colder regions, underground spaces could help protect supplies from freezing temperatures. Again, the exact effect depended on climate, depth, construction, ventilation, and moisture. But the basic principle remained. The earth changes slowly. The surface changes quickly. People learned to take advantage of that difference. And perhaps this is why the phrase, "sleep underground," can be misleading. The more accurate image is often sleeping in a house that uses the earth for shelter. That could mean a sunken floor, a partly buried wall, a cellar, a structure built into a slope, or a small building whose lower portion was below the surrounding ground. The variety matters, because medieval Europe lasted for roughly 1,000 years. Technology changed, building traditions changed, settlements changed, climate changed, political boundaries changed, and people moved. A house from the early medieval period could look very different from one built several centuries later. A rural dwelling in Scandinavia could look completely different from a home in southern Europe. Even the meaning of underground could change from one place to another. Some structures were deeply sunken, others were only slightly below ground level. Some were primarily workspaces, others may have had domestic functions. Archaeologists must therefore examine evidence carefully before deciding exactly how a particular building was used. A depression in the ground does not automatically mean a bedroom. A hearth does not automatically prove a family lived there. A pit does not automatically mean a person slept underground. Historical reconstruction requires patience. And that patience is important because popular stories can turn a small archaeological clue into a sweeping claim about an entire civilization. The reality is usually quieter. Evidence shows variety. People experimented. They adapted. They built differently depending on circumstances. And ordinary families made decisions that rarely entered written history. This is perhaps the most beautiful part of studying these forgotten homes. You begin to see history from the ground upward. Not from kings downward, not from castles downward, but from the place where someone once laid a sleeping mat, a small patch of earth, a hearth, a post hole, a broken piece of pottery, a handful of charcoal, a stain in the soil. Each fragment can tell part of a story. Perhaps someone once sat beside that hearth on a rainy evening. Perhaps a child once slept on that floor. Perhaps someone repaired a shoe beside the doorway. Perhaps an elderly person once watched the fire fade before closing their eyes. We cannot know every detail, but the structure itself tells us that people were there. They built something. They used it. They repaired it. They eventually left it, and the earth slowly covered what remained. Centuries passed. The house disappeared. The landscape changed, yet the ground kept a quiet memory. And now, as we imagine that forgotten dwelling again, the night begins to settle. The wind moves across the field. Rain touches the roof. Inside, the room is dim. A family prepares for sleep. There is no separate bedroom for every person. There is no perfect temperature. There is no soft mattress designed for comfort. There is only the shelter they have made, and it is enough for tonight. The fire gives a little warmth. The earth gives a little protection. The walls keep out some of the wind. The household draws close together. One by one, voices become quieter. The last tasks are finished. A pot is moved aside. A door is secured. The embers are watched. Then darkness returns. For the people inside, this is not an archaeological site. It is not a symbol of the Middle Ages. It is simply home. And as they sleep, the earth remains around them, silent and steady. The same earth that gave them clay, stone, plants, and food is now helping protect them from the night. By morning, they will return to the surface, but for a few quiet hours, they remain sheltered between timber, soil, darkness, and fire. And somewhere above them, the stars continue moving across the winter sky. The story of the underground home is therefore not really about living beneath the world. It is about learning how to live with the world. The medieval household could not control the climate. It could not command the seasons. It could not produce unlimited fuel. So it learned to cooperate with the materials around it. The earth became part of the shelter. The fire became part of the routine. The darkness became part of the night. And sleep became possible within that carefully balanced world. When we return to this household in the next part of our journey, we can look more closely at the people themselves, the farmers, families, workers, and children who inhabited these humble spaces, and what a single night of sleep may actually have felt like when the floor beneath them was made of earth. The night has passed, and beneath the quiet earth, the household is beginning to wake. For a moment, nothing changes. The room remains dim. The air is cool. The last embers of the fire are almost black. Then someone moves beneath a woolen covering. A hand reaches toward the hearth. A small sound breaks the silence. Perhaps it is the scrape of wood against ash. Perhaps it is a cough. Perhaps it is the soft movement of someone rising carefully so as not to disturb the others. This is how another medieval day might begin. Not with an alarm. Not with electric light. Not with the sudden brightness of a modern room. But gradually, almost invisibly, the darkness becomes gray. The household begins to stir. And for the people who lived in earth-sheltered or partly sunken homes, this daily rhythm was closely connected to the seasons. In summer, morning could arrive early. In winter, darkness could remain for much longer. The amount of daylight available affected work. It affected travel. It affected cooking. It affected farming. And it affected sleep. A medieval person did not simply decide that the day would begin at 7 in the morning. The sun was a much more important clock. Picture yourself stepping outside. The air is cold enough to sting your face. The ground is damp. Mist lies low over the fields. The house behind you is partly hidden by the slope of the land. You can barely see the lower walls. Smoke rises slowly into the morning air. For a modern observer, the building might look humble. For the people who lived there, it represented countless hours of work. Someone had gathered the timber. Someone had dug or prepared the floor. Someone had carried earth. Someone had made or acquired the roofing materials. Someone had repaired the structure after storms. Someone had maintained the hearth. A house was never finished. It was continuously maintained. This was particularly true for buildings made from materials such as timber, thatch, clay, and earth. Rain could damage them. Wind could loosen roofing. Water could weaken walls. Pests could attack stored food. Smoke could darken surfaces. The ground itself could shift. A household had to notice problems early. A small leak was better than a collapsed roof. A damp patch was better discovered before it became a flooded floor. A broken door had to be repaired before winter. In this sense, the medieval home was not simply a shelter. It was an ongoing project, and sleeping underground did not remove that burden. It created new responsibilities. One of the most important was keeping water away. Imagine a storm arriving after several days of rain. The sky becomes dark. The wind rises. Water begins running across the ground. A house built slightly above the surrounding land might shed water easily. A sunken structure had to be more careful. The entrance needed protection. Drainage mattered. The roof needed to direct rain away from the walls. The slope of the ground could determine whether water passed by or collected. A poorly placed structure could become wet and unhealthy. So the choice to build partly underground was not automatically an easy one. It was a trade. You gained protection from wind and temperature changes. You risked greater problems with moisture. Good builders understood the difference. And generations of local experience helped. People learned from older buildings. They learned from failures. They watched how rain moved. They watched how snow melted. They knew where water gathered. They knew which places were safe. This knowledge could be passed through families and communities without ever being written down. A child watching a parent build could learn things that no manuscript described. Where to dig, where not to dig, how deep to make a floor, how to place a post, how to cover a wall, how to repair a roof, how to keep a fire burning. These were practical sciences. They were simply called living, and the same was true of sleeping. A medieval person learned how to sleep in their particular environment. They learned how to arrange bedding. They learned how to dress for cold nights. They learned where drafts entered. They learned which part of the room stayed warmest. They learned when to add fuel. They learned how to share limited warmth. This was especially important because the bed itself might provide much of the insulation. A straw mattress was not soft in the way a modern mattress is soft. But straw traps air. Air is a poor conductor of heat. A thick layer of dry plant material could therefore provide some insulation between the body and the cold floor. Wool was also valuable. Wool fibers naturally trap air. Blankets, cloaks, and other woolen textiles could help retain body heat. Furs were used in many societies, depending on availability and wealth. Layers mattered. The medieval sleeping environment was therefore not simply a cold floor. It was a collection of materials working together. Earth, straw, wool, wood, fire, clothing, human bodies. Each provided a little protection. Together, they could make sleep possible. Imagine lying down after a long day. The mattress beneath you is firm. You can feel uneven places beneath the fabric. The blanket is heavy. The room smells faintly of smoke. Someone nearby is already asleep. The fire has become a low red glow. Outside, rain taps softly against the roof. You pull the wool closer around your shoulders. The cold has not disappeared, but the room is sheltered. The wind cannot touch you directly. The earth around the walls reduces some of the rapid changes in temperature. Your body slowly becomes still. This is not luxury, it is adaptation. And human beings have always been remarkably good at adaptation. We sometimes assume that people in the past simply accepted terrible living conditions because they had no imagination. That is not true. They constantly experimented. They improved tools. They changed building techniques. They altered roofs. They developed better heating arrangements. They changed sleeping materials. They used local resources creatively. What they lacked was not intelligence. They lacked the energy systems, industrial materials, and technologies that make modern comfort possible. That distinction matters. A medieval farmer could understand the importance of insulation without knowing the science of heat transfer. A builder could understand drainage without knowing modern hydrology. A healer could understand that damp living conditions were unhealthy without knowing modern microbiology. People learned from observation, and sometimes their solutions were surprisingly effective. The earth-sheltered building is one example. Another was the use of thick walls. Another was the arrangement of rooms. Another was the careful positioning of fireplaces. Another was the use of textiles. Another was simply sleeping close to other people. Body heat was real. A group of people in a small enclosed room could create a warmer environment than one person alone. This does not mean that medieval families deliberately crowded together as a scientific heating system. They shared rooms because homes were often small, but the physical result was still there. The household generated warmth simply by existing, and animals could contribute too. This is why medieval homes sometimes contained a mixture of smells and sounds that would seem strange today. People, animals, fire, food, leather, wool, straw, earth, all occupying the same general environment. For the medieval household, these were ordinary elements of life. Imagine waking in the night because a cow moves nearby. You hear the animal shifting. A wooden structure creaks. Someone mutters quietly. Then everything becomes still again. The sound of an animal was not necessarily a disturbance in the modern sense. It was part of the household. Animals represented food, labor, clothing materials, transportation, and wealth. A cow could provide milk. A sheep could provide wool. A horse could provide transport. A pig could provide meat. Chickens could provide eggs. Losing an animal could be economically serious. So protecting livestock was important. In some regions and building traditions, keeping animals close to people could also offer practical advantages during severe weather. But again, we should not imagine that every medieval house was one large room filled with livestock. Arrangements varied enormously. Some animals had separate barns. Some were housed in attached structures. Some were kept outside except during harsh conditions. The important point is that the boundary between human living space and animal space was often much less rigid than it is today. And this affected sleeping. A person might fall asleep hearing animals outside, or perhaps through a wall, or perhaps in an attached space. The sounds of the household continued through the night. A medieval village was not silent. Even after dark, there could be movement. Animals made sounds. People traveled. Doors opened. Dogs barked. Wind moved through trees. Rain struck roofs. The difference was that these sounds existed without the constant background noise of engines and machines. Night could still be very dark, and darkness shaped people's imagination. Before modern lighting, a dark room was genuinely dark. A candle produced only a small area of illumination. An oil lamp could brighten a limited space. A fire gave light, but mostly close to itself. Beyond that small circle, objects disappeared into shadow. It was part of the household. Animals represented food, labor, clothing materials, transportation, and wealth. A cow could provide milk. A sheep could provide wool. A horse could provide transport. A pig could provide meat. Chickens could provide eggs. Losing an animal could be economically serious. So protecting livestock was important. In some regions and building traditions, keeping animals close to people could also offer practical advantages during severe weather. But again, we should not imagine that every medieval house was one large room filled with livestock. Arrangements varied enormously. Some animals had separate barns. Some were housed in attached structures. Some were kept outside except during harsh conditions. The important point is that the boundary between human living space and animal space was often much less rigid than it is today. And this affected sleeping. A person might fall asleep hearing animals outside, or perhaps through a wall, or perhaps in an attached space. The sounds of the household continued through the night. A medieval village was not silent. Even after dark, there could be movement. Animals made sounds. People traveled. Doors opened. Dogs barked. Wind moved through trees. Rain struck roofs. The difference was that these sounds existed without the constant background noise of engines and machines. Night could still be very dark, and darkness shaped people's imagination. Before modern lighting, a dark room was genuinely dark. A candle produced only a small area of illumination. An oil lamp could brighten a limited space. A fire gave light, but mostly close to itself. Beyond that small circle, objects disappeared into shadow. For someone sleeping partly underground, this could be even stronger. There might be no window at sleeping level. If there was an opening, it could be small. The room could become completely black once the fire died. This darkness was not necessarily frightening. Humans adapt to darkness too. Eyes gradually adjust. People knew their homes by touch. They knew where the hearth was. They knew where the door was. They knew where sleeping companions were. A person could move through the familiar room without seeing everything clearly. Still, darkness imposed limits. If something happened during the night, finding a light source required effort. A person might need to reach for a candle, a lamp, or the hearth. Fire had to be treated carefully. A flame too close to straw or cloth could be dangerous. This meant that sleeping itself required trust. Trust in the roof. Trust in the walls. Trust in the fire. Trust in the people around you. And perhaps most of all, trust that the weather would not overwhelm the shelter. That trust could be tested. Winter storms were serious. Heavy rain could flood lower spaces. Strong winds could damage roofs. Deep snow could place weight on structures. Extreme cold could threaten people and animals. Yet the medieval climate was not one endless winter. There were warm periods, there were mild years, there were hot summers, The Middle Ages covered a huge geographical area and a very long period of time. Weather varied from decade to decade. This is another reason we should avoid imagining one universal medieval climate. A house designed for a northern environment could look very different from one designed for a southern environment. In a warm region, an underground room might be useful because it remained cool. In a cold region, the same earth could help reduce heat loss. The same basic principle could serve different purposes, and sometimes the underground space was not originally designed for sleeping at all. A cellar might become a shelter. A storage room might be used temporarily. A workshop might serve multiple purposes. A lower floor might become domestic space. People used buildings flexibly because buildings were valuable. If a room existed, someone found a use for it. This practical flexibility is one of the strongest features of pre-modern life. Modern buildings often have very specific functions. A bedroom is a bedroom. A garage is a garage. A kitchen is a kitchen. A basement is a basement. Medieval buildings could be less rigid. A room could change according to season. A space could store food in one period and house someone in another. A barn could shelter people during emergencies. A cellar could provide refuge from heat. A lower room could be used for work. The building adapted because people needed it to adapt. This also explains why the phrase "sleeping underground" should never be treated as a single custom. It describes many different situations. A person could sleep below ground because the house had a sunken floor. Another could sleep in a cellar. Another could sleep in a dwelling built into a hillside. Another could sleep in a lower room beneath a larger building. Another could simply sleep on a floor that was slightly lower than the surrounding ground. These experiences were not identical, but they shared one important feature. The earth played a role in creating shelter, and the earth was everywhere. That availability made it one of the most useful building resources in the medieval world. Wood had to be cut. Stone had to be quarried. Metal had to be extracted and worked. Glass was difficult and valuable, but soil was already beneath people's feet. Clay could be shaped. Earth could be moved. A slope could be used. A pit could become a foundation. A bank could become a wall. The landscape itself could become part of the architecture. This is a very different way of thinking about construction. Today, we often imagine a building as an object placed on land. Traditional builders often thought of the building and landscape together. The hill influenced the house. The river influenced the settlement. The forest influenced the walls. The soil influenced the floor. The climate influenced the roof. The availability of fuel influenced the hearth. Everything was connected, and that connection is particularly clear when we consider sleep. Sleep is a vulnerable state. When you sleep, you cannot work. You cannot gather food. You cannot easily respond to danger. You need protection. The home, therefore, had to create a safe sleeping environment. For some people, being partly below ground helped. The walls shielded them. The earth surrounded them. The room remained relatively stable. The household could gather together. And when the fire was low, the shelter still remained. This was perhaps the quiet advantage. The earth did not produce warmth. It preserved stability. It slowed the outside world. Wind could rage above. The temperature could fall. But several layers of material stood between the sleeper and the open air. Roof, timber, earth, textile, straw, wool, body. Each layer mattered. The medieval person did not need to know the exact thermal value of each material. They knew that certain arrangements worked, and if an arrangement worked, it was remembered. This knowledge passed through generations. A child grew up watching adults prepare the house. Later, that child became responsible for a household. The lessons remained. Where should the bed go? Where should the fire be placed? How should the roof be repaired? Where should the entrance face? Where should rainwater drain? Which materials last longest? Which places stay dry? These questions were practical knowledge. They were part of survival, and survival was never only about food. It was also about shelter. A person could have enough grain and still suffer in a cold, wet house. A family could have animals and still lose them during a severe winter. A household could have fuel and still waste it through poor construction. So building wisely was part of living wisely. This is why the humble dwelling deserves attention. It tells us about medieval society in a way that castles cannot. A castle shows power. A church shows faith. A palace shows wealth. But a small sunken house shows ordinary life. It shows how people solved problems with limited resources. It shows how they slept, how they stored things, how they cooked, how they stayed warm, how they shared space, and sometimes how they endured discomfort, because there was discomfort. We should not romanticize it. Damp bedding was unpleasant. Smoke could irritate the eyes. Cold floors could be painful. Straw mattresses could become hard and uneven. Insects could be a problem. Fleas and lice were common historical realities. Personal hygiene standards differed greatly from modern expectations. And a crowded household could mean little privacy. The underground dwelling could protect against some dangers while making others more noticeable. A damp room could be difficult to keep healthy. Poor ventilation could make smoke linger. A small space could become crowded. A wet winter could test every weakness in the structure. The brutal truth is that medieval comfort had limits. People were not secretly enjoying a perfect natural lifestyle. They were doing what they could. And sometimes what they could do was surprisingly clever. Sometimes it was barely enough. Sometimes it failed. That uncertainty was part of life. Imagine a family listening to heavy rain at night. The sound becomes louder. Water runs down the slope. Someone wakes. They listen. Is the entrance staying dry? Is water coming through the wall? Does the roof still hold? A person rises. They move carefully through the darkness. Perhaps they place a container beneath a leak. Perhaps they push soil against a wet section. Perhaps nothing happens at all. The storm passes. The room remains dry. Everyone sleeps again. These small moments would never become famous. Yet they were repeated across generations. And when we study them, the medieval world becomes more human. Not a distant collection of dates, but people listening to rain, people waiting for dawn, people hoping their roof survives the winter, people protecting a fire, people preparing a bed, people trying to sleep. This is the quiet history beneath the grand history. And as the next night approaches, the household returns to the same familiar rhythm. The fields darken, the animals settle, the fire burns lower, someone spreads fresh straw, someone folds a blanket, someone closes the door. The underground room becomes still. The earth around it remains cool. The roof holds back the weather, and inside, the family lies down once again. They do not think about thermal mass. They do not think about archaeology. They do not think about medieval architecture. They simply know that the room is safer than the open field. They know that the earth helps. They know that the fire will probably last until morning. And for tonight, that is enough. The darkness deepens. The last voices fade. A small ember glows. Outside, the wind moves across the settlement. Inside, breathing becomes slow and steady. The house rests. The earth rests. And the people beneath it sleep. But there is another part of this story still waiting beneath the surface. Because living underground was not only about warmth and shelter. It was also connected to food, storage, work, social status, and the unequal realities of medieval life. Some people had thick walls and large rooms. Others had only a small space beneath a simple roof. Some could afford better bedding. Others slept on the barest materials. And in the next part of our journey, we will move closer to that difference, quietly following the lives of the people who had the least, and discovering what their sleeping spaces reveal about the true cost of surviving the medieval night. The night has settled over the village again. Beneath the roof, the household is quiet. The fire has been reduced to a few glowing embers, and the smell of smoke lingers gently in the air. Outside, the ground is dark and wet. But inside, several people are trying to sleep. They are close together because the room is small. There is little empty space. A few possessions rest against the walls. A wooden chest, some baskets, a cooking vessel, tools, clothing, perhaps a bundle of grain, perhaps a few pieces of firewood waiting for morning. Nothing has been placed there simply for decoration. Every object has a purpose. And this is one of the first things we need to understand about poorer medieval households. Space was precious. The home had to work hard. A single room might support almost every part of daily life. During the day, it could be a workplace. In the evening, it could become a place for eating. At night, it became a sleeping area. The floor was not merely a floor, it was part of the household's working surface. The walls were not simply boundaries, they helped hold warmth. The roof was not merely a cover, it protected people, animals, food, and possessions. And the earth beneath the building was not just soil. It could become part of the architecture itself. For a poor household, this mattered enormously. A wealthy family could solve problems by spending money. They could purchase better materials. They could hire skilled workers. They could build larger rooms. They could acquire more bedding. They could keep more fuel. A poor family had fewer choices. Their solutions had to come from what was available. That might mean digging into the ground. It might mean using local timber. It might mean packing walls with earth or clay. It might mean using straw as insulation. It might mean sharing sleeping space. The result was not elegant, but it could be practical. And practicality was often more important than appearance. Imagine walking into a wealthy medieval residence. The difference could be immediate. The building might contain multiple rooms. There could be better furnishings, more textiles, more storage, better lighting, perhaps fireplaces in more than one space. There might be private chambers for important members of the household. The sleeping environment could be more comfortable. But even wealth did not eliminate the basic problems of pre-modern life. Cold still existed. Firewood still had to burn. Storms still arrived. Roofs still needed repair. Water still had to be managed. The difference was that wealth gave people more ways to respond. A poor family might sleep in a simple room, partly below ground. A wealthy household might have a stone-built chamber above the ground. Both experienced winter, but they experienced it differently. This difference is easy to miss when we use the phrase medieval people. There were millions of medieval people. They did not share one lifestyle. A noblewoman sleeping in a stone chamber, and a farm laborer sleeping on a straw mattress, belong to the same broad historical period, but their nights could feel like different worlds. For the poor, sleeping underground could sometimes be part of a broader strategy of making limited resources last. A smaller building required less material. A partially sunken structure could reduce exposure. A shared sleeping area meant less space had to be heated. And a single fire could warm several people at once. There was no expectation that everyone should have their own room. In fact, the idea of a private bedroom for every member of a household is relatively modern. For many medieval families, sleeping was a communal activity. Parents and children could sleep near one another. Servants could sleep in the same building. Guests might be accommodated where space allowed. Beds themselves could be shared. This was not always a sign of affection. Often, it was simply practical. If a room was small, there was nowhere else to sleep. And when the temperature dropped, sharing warmth was useful. Imagine the household settling down. Someone spreads a blanket. Another person adjusts the straw beneath a mattress. A child is placed close to an adult. The fire is allowed to burn lower. There is no bright light. The room slowly disappears into darkness. The people inside become little more than breathing shapes beneath blankets. Outside, the temperature continues to fall, but the earth around the lower walls remains relatively stable. The building does not become warm. It simply loses heat more slowly than an exposed shelter might. That difference can feel enormous when you have no central heating. Today, a few degrees may seem like a minor change. For someone sleeping in winter without modern insulation, a small reduction in heat loss could make a night noticeably easier. The body itself became part of the heating system. People wore layers. They used blankets. They slept together. They positioned themselves near warmth, and the building helped retain what little heat they produced. This was not a single invention. It was a combination of small choices. The right location, the right materials, the right arrangement, the right amount of fuel, the right clothing, the right bedding. Each decision mattered. And sometimes, even these choices were not enough. The hardest nights came when weather became extreme. A severe winter could threaten the entire household. Cold could damage crops. Snow could block roads. Animals could become difficult to feed. Stored food became essential. Fuel could become scarce. And the home itself could become a test of endurance. This is where underground and semi-underground spaces had another advantage. They could provide storage. A lower room or cellar could help protect food from sunlight and rapid temperature changes. Vegetables could be stored. Grain could be kept in suitable containers. Fermented drinks could be stored. Other supplies could be placed underground. The exact storage methods varied, but the principle was simple. Food needed protection. The earth could provide it. A cellar was therefore not necessarily a sleeping chamber. But in a small household, the boundary between storage and living space could become flexible. A room might be used differently depending on the season. A space used for work could later be used for sleeping. A lower room could serve several purposes. This flexibility was not unusual. It was a response to limited space. And there was another practical advantage. The earth offered darkness. For certain stored foods, darkness was useful. Direct sunlight could damage some products. Cooler temperatures could slow spoilage. Stable conditions could help preserve supplies. This made underground spaces valuable even when nobody slept there. In other words, the same architectural choice that helped protect a person could also help protect their food. The home became a small survival system. People, animals, fire, food, water, tools, all had to fit together. This is why medieval architecture cannot be separated from medieval economics. A house reflected what a household could afford. A poor house might be small because the family had limited resources. A wealthy house could be large because its owner controlled more land, labor, and materials. Building size could reflect social position. So could bedding. So could clothing. So could heating. A wealthy person might have a bed frame. They might have curtains. They might have more layers of textile. They might have better mattresses. They might have more private space. A poor person could have none of these. The difference was not merely aesthetic. It affected sleep. It affected warmth. It affected privacy. It affected health. And it reveals something important about the phrase brutal truth. The harshest part of medieval sleeping was not that everyone slept underground. They did not. The harsh truth was that comfort was distributed unequally. For some, a night of sleep could happen in a reasonably warm and furnished chamber. For others, sleep happened in crowded conditions, on hard surfaces, with limited bedding and constant exposure to cold. The earth could help, but it could not erase poverty. This distinction is important because historical stories sometimes make hardship sound strangely romantic. A small underground room can look beautiful in an illustration. Warm firelight, wooden beams, straw bedding, a peaceful family gathered together. It creates a gentle picture. But real life included discomfort. The straw could contain insects. Bedding could become dirty. Smoke could irritate the eyes. Moisture could remain in the room. A crowded household could spread illness. Cold could make joints ache. There could be unpleasant smells. There could be noise. There could be arguments. There could be hunger. A beautiful reconstruction cannot show all of that. The real medieval home was not a cozy fantasy. It was a place where people worked extremely hard. And then they slept. Sometimes the greatest luxury was simply being able to close the door. This brings us to another important question. Why would someone choose to sleep underground rather than simply build a normal house? Sometimes the answer may be that they did not have a meaningful choice. If a household had limited materials, digging into the earth could reduce the amount of wall that needed to be constructed above ground. The earth itself became a building material. A shallow excavation could create a lower floor. Posts could support walls and roof structures. The surrounding soil could help stabilize the space. This did not make the structure effortless. Digging required labor. Removing earth required tools and time. But compared with constructing tall walls entirely from stone, it could sometimes be practical. This is especially important in areas where timber or stone was expensive or limited. Local resources shaped architecture. A house was an expression of geography, and geography could be unforgiving. In some regions, winters were long. In others, summers were extremely hot. In some areas, heavy rain was common. In others, drought mattered more. A building that worked well in one environment might be completely unsuitable in another. So people built according to local experience. They observed, they experimented, they adapted, and over time, those adaptations became traditions. The knowledge of one generation became the starting point for the next. A child might learn that a particular slope stays dry. Another might learn that a certain kind of earth is easy to work. Someone might learn that a particular roofing material survives winter better. Another might know how to repair a wall after heavy rain. This was a form of local engineering. It did not require formal schools. It required observation, and it was often shared through communities. Imagine a small village during a building project. Several people are working. Someone holds a timber. Someone else digs. Another person shapes material. Older workers watch carefully. Younger people carry tools and earth. Instructions are short. The knowledge is practical. No one needs to explain every principle. Everyone understands what needs to happen. A house slowly takes shape. Part of it rises. Part of it sinks. The earth surrounds the lower walls. The roof protects the whole structure. When the work is complete, the building does not look impressive, but it works. And that is what matters. A medieval home did not need to impress a visitor. It needed to survive the next winter. This focus on survival also influenced sleeping habits. People slept where the household could create the best conditions. That might be near the hearth. It might be against an interior wall. It might be on a raised platform. It might be on the floor. It might be in a loft. It might be in a lower room. There was no universal answer. The important thing was protection. Protection from cold. Protection from damp. Protection from animals. Protection from drafts. Protection from the outside world. And protection from each other when necessary. Because a crowded room could also create problems. Privacy was limited. A person might hear everything happening around them. Someone waking in the night could disturb everyone else. A crying child could wake the household. An animal could make noise. A cough could travel across the room. The sound of breathing was part of the night. For modern people accustomed to separate rooms, this can feel strange. But shared sleeping was common in many historical societies. The idea of complete privacy during sleep is not universal. And perhaps there was also a sense of security in sleeping together. A person was not alone. If something happened, others were nearby. The household functioned as a unit. When one person woke, someone else might help. When the fire needed attention, someone was there. When a child became ill, an adult was nearby. When a storm became severe, the family was together. The same closeness that reduced privacy could also provide comfort. Imagine lying awake during a storm. The wind is pushing against the roof. Rain strikes the walls. The room is dark, but you can hear another person breathing nearby. You know that you are not alone. The sound becomes familiar. The storm continues. Eventually, sleep returns. This kind of quiet companionship is easy to imagine even across centuries. Human beings have always found comfort in familiar sounds. A sleeping household, a nearby fire, the occasional movement of someone you trust. These things have not changed very much. What changed was the environment around them. And the medieval environment could be harsh. One of the greatest challenges was damp. Cold and damp together were especially unpleasant. A room could be warm near the hearth and cold near the walls. Moisture could settle on surfaces. Wet clothing could take a long time to dry. Straw could absorb moisture. Wood could decay. If ventilation was poor, the interior could become unhealthy. This is where the underground advantage became a contradiction. The earth could stabilize temperature, but the earth could also introduce moisture. A well-drained, earth-sheltered structure could be useful. A poorly drained one could become miserable. The success of the design depended on conditions. This is why archaeology alone cannot always tell us exactly how a room was used. Researchers have to consider many clues. The shape of the structure, the depth, the position of entrances, the location of hearths, the presence of storage pits, the types of artifacts found, the soil conditions, the surrounding settlement, the regional building tradition. Each clue contributes to the picture. A single depression is not enough. A single hearth is not enough. history requires several pieces to fit together. And sometimes the evidence remains uncertain. That uncertainty is honest. We do not need to turn every archaeological mystery into a definite story. Sometimes, the most accurate answer is simply that people used the space in ways we cannot completely reconstruct. Perhaps it was a workshop, perhaps a storage room, perhaps temporary shelter, perhaps domestic space, perhaps several things at different times. This flexibility was common in the medieval world. Buildings changed as families changed. A house could be expanded. A wall could be moved. A floor could be raised. A lower room could be abandoned. A new structure could be built beside an older one. People did not always preserve buildings as historical monuments. They changed them according to need. Eventually, some were abandoned. Perhaps the family moved. Perhaps the settlement changed. Perhaps a flood damaged the structure. Perhaps the roof failed. Perhaps a new building replaced it. Once abandoned, the earth slowly reclaimed the space. The roof collapsed. Walls fell inward. Rain carried soil into the depression. Grass grew. Trees appeared. A generation passed. Then another. The house disappeared. And the people who had slept there became anonymous. But their sleeping place remained, quietly waiting beneath the soil. There is something deeply peaceful about that image. A household once filled that space with voices. Now there is only earth. The same ground that once surrounded the sleeping family now covers the remains of their home. The fire is gone. The bedding is gone. The tools are gone. The voices are gone. But the shape remains. And when archaeologists uncover it, they are not simply finding a building. They are finding a fragment of ordinary human life, a place where people once woke, worked, ate, rested, and slept. Perhaps someone once lay there listening to rain. Perhaps someone once complained about the cold. Perhaps someone once repaired the roof after a storm. Perhaps a child once fell asleep beside a parent. We cannot know their names, but we know that someone needed shelter, and that simple need connects them to us. Because even after centuries of technological change, the human body still needs warmth, still needs rest, still seeks shelter, still responds to darkness, still feels the difference between a dry room and a damp one, still finds comfort in familiar sounds. The medieval world was different. But the person inside the house was still human. As evening returns, the household begins its familiar routine again. Food is finished. Tools are put away. The floor is cleared. Bedding is prepared. The fire is reduced. The door is closed. Outside, the temperature drops. Inside, the earth holds the room steady. The family lies down. For a while, there is conversation. Then silence. The fire glows. The roof creaks. Someone turns over. A dog shifts. The wind passes overhead. And once again, sleep arrives. The underground home has done what it was built to do. Not create luxury. Not eliminate hardship. Simply provide shelter. And sometimes, in the medieval world, shelter was one of the most valuable things a person could possess. The night deepens, the household sleeps, and beneath their bodies, the earth remains silent. But the story is not finished, because some of the most revealing evidence about medieval sleeping spaces comes not from grand houses, but from the remains of ordinary settlements. In the next part, we will follow those traces through the archaeological landscape and look at what the soil, hearths, floors, and abandoned houses can tell us about the people who once lived so close to the ground. The night is quiet now. The small dwelling has almost disappeared beneath the darkness. Only a faint glow remains where the fire once burned brightly. The people inside are sleeping. Above them, the sky stretches across the fields. The stars are hidden by clouds. A light rain begins to fall. Drops touch the roof one after another. Inside, the sound is softened. The walls hold back the wind. The earth surrounds the lower part of the dwelling. For a few hours, the household is protected. And this is where our journey through medieval underground sleeping finally brings us. Not to a strange, secret world beneath medieval Europe. Not to a civilization where everyone lived below the ground. But to something much more ordinary. People were trying to make homes work. They were trying to stay warm. They were trying to stay dry. They were trying to preserve food. They were trying to save fuel. They were trying to build with the materials they could obtain, and sometimes the easiest material to use was the earth beneath their feet. When we look at the remains of these buildings today, the first thing we notice is often their simplicity. There may be little left, a shallow depression, a few post holes, a dark patch of soil, fragments of pottery, a concentration of charcoal, perhaps the remains of a hearth. At first, it seems almost insignificant, but imagine what that patch of earth once contained. A roof, walls, a fire, food, tools, clothing, people. A family could have spent years there. Children could have grown up there. Someone could have been born there. Someone could have died there. A lifetime could have unfolded within a space that now looks like nothing more than a hollow in a field. Archaeology reminds us that ordinary life rarely leaves monuments. Kings leave tombs. Rulers leave palaces. Religious communities leave great buildings. But the poorest families may leave only a few marks in the ground. Those marks are therefore precious. They allow us to hear, very faintly, the lives of people who left almost no written record. And sometimes, those traces show us that the boundary between underground and above-ground living was not clear. A structure could be partly sunken without being completely underground. A lower floor could be below the surrounding land, while the roof remained visible. A cellar could exist beneath a larger building. A house could be built into a slope. A pit could serve as storage. A room could have more than one purpose. This variety is important. The phrase, medieval people slept underground, sounds simple. The reality was not. Some did. Some may have slept in semi-sunken spaces. Some slept above ground. Some slept in lofts. Some slept in halls. Some slept in chambers. Some slept in barns or other temporary spaces under particular circumstances. And some households changed their arrangements over time. The medieval world was too large and too varied for one sleeping pattern to describe everyone. But the repeated use of earth-sheltered spaces tells us something valuable. People understood their environment. They recognized that the earth could protect them. They used that knowledge when it made sense. This is perhaps the most important lesson. Medieval architecture was not simply primitive architecture. It was local architecture. It was architecture shaped by available resources. A builder did not begin with a blank sheet of paper. The builder began with a landscape. There was a particular soil, a particular climate, a particular amount of timber, a particular supply of stone, a particular amount of labor, and a particular community with its own traditions. The building emerged from those conditions. That is why the same basic need could produce very different houses. A person living in a wooded region might rely heavily on timber. Someone living where stone was abundant might use masonry. Someone living where earth and clay were easily available could incorporate them into the structure. Someone living on a hillside might use the slope itself. The house became a reflection of the land, and the sleeping space became a reflection of the house. If the house was small, sleeping was communal. If the house was large, there might be more separation. If the climate was cold, warmth became central. If the climate was hot, shade and coolness mattered. If rain was heavy, drainage became essential. If fuel was scarce, conserving heat became important. Everything connected. The medieval home was a system, and the person sleeping inside it was part of that system. Consider the simple problem of heat. A modern bedroom can be heated independently from the rest of the house. A medieval household often could not divide heat so easily. The fire was central. People gathered near it. Rooms were arranged around it when possible. Sleeping areas were chosen according to warmth and space. The building itself helped determine how much heat remained. This is why a thick wall or earth-covered surface mattered. It could slow the movement of heat. The difference might not be dramatic. But when fuel was limited, small improvements mattered. A little less heat lost each hour meant a little less wood needed. A little less wood needed meant less work. And less work could matter enormously to a family already spending much of its life laboring. This is the quiet economics of medieval comfort. Comfort had a cost. Warmth had a cost. Light had a cost. Privacy had a cost. Space had a cost. Even sleep had a cost because a person needed to maintain the shelter where sleep could happen. The medieval person did not pay these costs with a monthly energy bill. They paid with labor. Someone gathered fuel. Someone repaired the roof. Someone cleaned the hearth. Someone collected bedding material. Someone repaired clothing. Someone carried water. Someone stored food. Someone maintained the walls. The home demanded work because survival demanded work. And perhaps this is the harshest truth of all. The difficult part of medieval sleeping was not simply that the bed was hard. The difficult part was everything that had to happen before the bed could be used. There had to be enough food, enough fuel, a roof, a dry place, bedding, clothing, protection. If any one of these failed, sleep could become difficult. Imagine the final evening before a long winter storm. The household checks its supplies. There is wood beside the hearth. Food has been stored. The roof has been inspected. The animals are protected. The door is secured. A family settles inside. The weather worsens. Wind moves over the roof. Snow begins to gather. The household is now completely dependent on the shelter. The walls become the boundary between survival and exposure. Inside, the family waits. The fire burns. Food is rationed. The night becomes long. The earth surrounding the lower walls provides another layer of protection. It cannot stop the storm, but it helps create a stable interior. And when morning comes, the household has survived another night. This is how architecture can become part of survival, not through dramatic technology, through small advantages. A thick wall, a low opening, a sheltered position, a good roof, a dry floor, a carefully managed hearth, a layer of straw, a wool blanket. A little knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Together, these small advantages could make a difficult life more manageable. There is another important part of the story. Medieval people did not necessarily see their homes as uncomfortable simply because they lacked modern features. They judged comfort by their own experience. A straw mattress might feel ordinary. A shared room might feel ordinary. A dark evening might feel ordinary. A smoky hearth might be accepted as part of life. People compare their lives with what they know. They do not compare themselves with the future. A medieval farmer did not lie down on a straw mattress, thinking about how much better a memory foam mattress would be. That possibility did not exist in their world. They knew what was available. They adapted to it. This does not mean they enjoyed every hardship. People have always disliked cold, pain, hunger, smoke, insects, and dampness. But familiarity changes perception. The ordinary can become comfortable simply because it is known. A person can find security in a humble home because it is theirs. The same building that looks miserable to us could represent safety to someone who had spent the day outside in rain. Imagine returning home after hours in a wet field. Your clothing is damp. Your hands are cold. Your feet hurt. You enter the house. The air is warmer. You smell smoke. Someone has prepared food. The fire is alive. Your family is there. Suddenly, the small room feels different. The walls may be rough. The floor may be hard. The bedding may be simple. But compared with the open field, the room feels safe. This is why we should not judge historical homes only by their appearance. Shelter is relative. A simple building can be precious when the alternative is exposure. And for many people, that was the reality. The house did not need to be beautiful. It needed to protect. That was its first purpose. The second might be warmth. The third might be storage. Then, cooking. Then work. And finally, sleep. The modern house often separates these functions into different rooms. The medieval house could combine them. That combination is one reason underground or semi-sunken spaces could be so useful. They were flexible. A lower room could be used for storage during one season. It could provide cool space during summer. It could shelter someone temporarily. It could become part of the living area. The building could change with the household's needs. This flexibility continued long after the Middle Ages. Across many traditional societies, people used underground and earth-sheltered architecture because the earth provided natural protection. The medieval experience was part of a much larger human story. People have always looked at the landscape and asked a simple question. How can this place help us survive? Sometimes the answer is stone, sometimes timber, sometimes water, sometimes fire, sometimes earth. And earth has one enormous advantage. It is everywhere. You can build against it. You can build into it. You can cover a wall with it. You can use it as a floor. You can use it to make bricks. You can use clay for construction. The landscape becomes part of the building. That is a very old human idea. And in the medieval world, it could be especially valuable because industrial alternatives did not exist. There was no factory-made insulation arriving in rolls. There were no modern waterproof membranes. There was no reinforced concrete foundation. There was no central heating system. There was no electric ventilation. People had to solve problems with simpler materials. Their solutions could be ingenious, but they could also fail. And when they failed, the consequences could be serious. A wet house could damage belongings. A leaking roof could ruin bedding. A broken wall could expose the household to cold. A fire could destroy a wooden structure. A severe winter could threaten food supplies. This is why medieval life cannot be described simply as either clever or primitive. It was both inventive and limited. People could solve problems remarkably well, but they had fewer resources with which to solve them. That combination shaped everyday life, and it shaped sleep. Perhaps the most surprising thing is how familiar some parts of the experience remain. At the end of a long day, people still wanted rest. They still wanted warmth. They still wanted a quiet place. They still wanted their families nearby. They still listened to rain. They still noticed the smell of smoke. They still woke when the house became too cold. They still pulled blankets closer. They still waited for morning. These experiences cross the centuries. The technology changes. The buildings change. But the human body does not change nearly as quickly. We still seek shelter. We still respond to temperature. We still become sleepy after exhausting work. We still find comfort in familiar surroundings. And that is why the story of a medieval sleeping place can feel unexpectedly intimate. We are not really looking at an ancient building. We are looking at a place where someone once rested their head, someone who had worries, someone who had responsibilities, someone who had people they cared about, someone who was tired, someone who needed sleep. Perhaps the person never imagined that their home would become evidence for historians. Perhaps they never thought their sleeping place was remarkable. It was simply where they lived. And that may be why ordinary history is so moving. The people who lived these lives did not know they were living in the Middle Ages. That is a label created later. They knew their village, their fields, their family, their lord, their church, their animals, their work, their weather, their home. When evening came, they wanted the same basic thing people have wanted for thousands of years. To be somewhere safe, to be somewhere sheltered, to rest. And so, as our imagined household settles down for the final time, the room becomes quiet. The fire is low. The roof is still. The earth is cool around the walls. A blanket covers the sleepers. Someone turns gently in the darkness. A child breathes softly. An adult listens for a moment to the rain. Then the household becomes still again. There is no glowing clock to tell them how late it is. No phone beside the bed. No electric light. No distant sound of traffic. Only the slow rhythm of breathing. The occasional crack of cooling wood. The soft sound of rain. And the steady silence of the earth. The people inside do not know what future centuries will bring. They do not know that one day their home will disappear. They do not know that the roof will collapse, that the walls will decay, that grass will grow over the place where they slept. They do not know that archaeologists may someday find the marks of their house. For now, there is only tonight. And tonight, the shelter is holding. The fire has given warmth. The earth has given stability. The roof has kept away the weather. The family is together. So they sleep. And eventually, morning comes. A faint light appears. The rain has stopped. The air outside is cold. Someone wakes and rises. The embers are stirred. A small flame appears. The room slowly brightens. Another day begins. The people leave their sleeping places. They begin the work of living again. The house waits behind them. It has survived another night. Perhaps it will survive another 100. Perhaps only a few. That uncertainty was part of medieval life. Nothing was permanent. Wood rotted. Thatch needed replacing. Walls cracked. Families moved. Settlements changed. And eventually, even the strongest buildings became part of the earth. But for a while, a house could stand. And while it stood, it gave people something incredibly valuable. A place to sleep. A place to return to. A place where the outside world could be kept at a distance. That is the real meaning behind medieval underground sleeping. The story is not that medieval people preferred to live beneath the earth. They did not all do so. The story is that people used the earth when it helped them solve practical problems. They used it to reduce exposure to wind, to moderate temperature, to create storage, to make efficient use of limited materials, to adapt homes to difficult landscapes. And sometimes they slept within spaces shaped by those choices. The brutal truth was not that everyone was forced to sleep underground. The brutal truth was that comfort was limited, resources were unequal, and survival required constant labor. But there was another truth too. People were resourceful. They understood their surroundings. They learned from experience. They built with what they had. They adapted. They endured. And within those humble shelters, ordinary life continued. Children grew. Families ate. People worked. Fires burned. Stories were told. Rain fell. Snow came. Summer returned. And night after night, people closed their eyes. Perhaps beneath a timber roof. Perhaps beside a hearth. Perhaps on a raised bed. Perhaps on a simple straw mattress. Perhaps in a room partly surrounded by earth. The details changed. The need did not. Sleep remained one of the few moments when the endless work of survival could pause. So imagine, one final time, that small medieval dwelling. The night is calm. The fields are silver beneath the moon. The village is silent. Inside, the last ember glows. The walls are dark. The earth is cool. The sleepers are warm enough. Outside, centuries are waiting. But inside, there is only this moment. A breath. Another breath. The soft movement of a blanket. The faint smell of ash. The quiet presence of the people nearby. And the deep, steady silence of the ground. You find yourself listening to that silence. The medieval world no longer seems like a distant collection of castles and battles. It feels smaller, closer. A house, a fire, a family, a night. A place to rest. And slowly, the darkness begins to fade. As the morning slowly arrives, the first light touches the fields. The household wakes. The fire is brought back to life. The door opens. Cold air enters. The sleepers rise. Another day begins. The earth remains beneath them, steady, silent, patient, and for a little while longer, the old house stands. Then, eventually, as all human shelters do, it passes into history. The people leave, the roof falls, the walls disappear, the grass grows, the soil closes over the place where they once slept. Centuries pass. And the earth keeps the memory, not in words, not in names, but in layers of soil, fragments of wood, charcoal from an old fire, and the faint outline of a home. A home that once protected someone through the night, a home that once smelled of smoke and straw, a home where someone once listened to rain, a home where someone once whispered good night. And perhaps that is the quietest truth of medieval history. Most of the people who shaped the past were not kings. They were ordinary people. They lived in ordinary houses. They worked ordinary days. And they slept ordinary nights. Some of those nights happened close to the earth. Not because the people were strange, not because they wanted to live in darkness, but because the earth was one of the few things they could always depend on. It was beneath their feet. It could shelter them. It could hold their homes. It could help preserve their food. And eventually, it would hold the remains of their houses too. So when you imagine medieval people sleeping underground, do not imagine an entire civilization hiding beneath the surface. Imagine something quieter. A family in a small home, a fire fading slowly, rain moving across the roof, a straw mattress beneath a blanket, a few possessions resting against a wall, a tired person closing their eyes after a long day, and beneath everything, the earth, cold, heavy, steady, keeping the wind away, holding the house in place, and carrying that little household gently through another medieval night. The night passes. Morning comes. Life continues. And somewhere beneath a field, the remains of that forgotten home are still waiting. Quietly, patiently, as if the earth itself is still keeping watch over the people who once slept there.